pleased to be welcoming our speaker today, Bishop Barber. Over the course of the last 2.5 years, Bishop Barber has, since he was ordained to be Episcopal, installed as the 5th Bishop of Oakland, he has become a very good friend of St. Mary's College. Bishop Barber would deeply respect and appreciate your pastoral, your intellectual, your theological leadership in the diocese, and your support of what we do here at St. Mary's College. I was going to read through his CV and the bishop's resume, and I'm not going to do that. He will speak for himself. The only thing I wanted to point out here is that as a Jesuit, you might have expected this might happen. He happens to be a graduate of a university in Spokane, Washington, Gonzaga University. Now, he has the good wisdom and the good sense to be here in Oakland, and we can arrange for, I forget what exactly the date is of our encounter with that university. We don't mention the name. That university. But we would love to have you as our guest. He has a very impressive resume, and his work is indeed significant, and the leadership you have given to us is very, very special. I really appreciate you making time in your busy schedule to be with us this afternoon to give us the reflections of the Pope Francis' encyclical. The subtitle of the encyclical is Care for Our Common Home. And Bishop Barber, I hope and would ask that you please consider St. Mary's College to be your common home, where you are always welcome in all that we do. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to your conversation, to our conversation.
Thank you very much for your very warm welcome. It's always nice to be here at St. Mary's, and especially to be in this chapel, which I always find, on coming through the door, a place of beauty and of peace. I immediately feel, as the brothers say, I'm in the presence of God when I come in here. The new encyclical of Pope Francis is a lengthy, comprehensive document that should be meditated on at length. My presentation this afternoon might best be seen as some initial reflections on it, with a suggested application to the mission of St. Mary's College. First, to understand the encyclical, we need to note its title and the audience to whom it is directed. There are different levels of papal teaching, and encyclicals are considered to be one of the more solemn forms. The word encyclical can best be translated as a circular letter. In the early church, bishops would send letters on important matters to other bishops in their region. The Bishop of Rome would also do this. In recent centuries, papal encyclicals have addressed serious matters in some part of the world or matters of concern to the entire church. Usually they've been written by the Pope to his brother bishops. But Pope John XXIII broke with precedent by addressing his encyclical Pacem in Terris to all people of goodwill. Subsequent popes have also done this when writing on matters that concern not only the church, but all members of the human family. So it's not a denominational encyclical. This is what Pope Francis has done with the encyclical Laudato Si. As you know, he chose the title of his encyclical from the Canticle of the Creatures by St. Francis of Assisi. It's also noteworthy that the Holy Father chose to cite the canticle in the original Italian. They say that Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures is the first work of Italian literature. It was not written in Latin, the canticle wasn't, which just about everything for common consumption in the 13th century was written in Latin, but not the Canticle of the Creatures. In St. Francis's day, most educated people could read Latin, and this was the common language employed in theological writings. Part of the remarkable program undertaken by the first Franciscans was that they preached in the marketplace in the language of the people. I think that by choosing to use Italian rather than Latin, Pope Francis is signaling from the very first words that he is not addressing himself solely to Catholics, but wants to enter into conversation with all people on the vital issue of the environment. As far as I've been able to research, it's the only title of an encyclical that's not in Latin. In the first sentence, Pope Francis writes, "In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. The image of our common home may be deceptively simple. We begin to plumb the richness of this remarkable document when we recall that the Greek word for house is oikos. And this is the root of three very important English words: ecology, economy, and ecumenism. As you spend time reading this encyclical, you will see how carefully the Holy Father weaves together the importance of responding to the environmental crisis, the economic iniquities or economic inequities that create an ever-widening gulf between the rich and the poor, and the underlying spiritual hunger felt by so many today. These issues are all interconnected, and solutions must be found by involving men and women of many perspectives and disciplines. If we are going to repair creation and safeguard the dignity of every human being living on our sister, Mother Earth, it will require cooperation, sacrifice, and goodwill from everyone. First point, our common home, ecology, economy, and ecumenism. In the first part of my talk, I'd like to comment on what Pope Francis has to say about our common home under the three headings of ecology, economy, and ecumenism. What I want to stress is his insistence that these are not three separate locations, like a park, a bank, and a church, but all rooms in one home, rooms that are integrally connected to one another. There's so much in this encyclical, and it occurred to me that one approach would be for me to limit myself to the paragraphs the Holy Father himself cited during his recent visit to the United States. My approach can be likened to a technique often used in archaeology today. Rather than unearthing entire ruins, archaeologists dig down at various points at the site, and this helps them get a clearer picture of the entire city that they are exploring. The paragraphs referenced by the Pope in his speeches suggest different facets of his encyclical. Ecology. As you know, questions about the environment and global warming are hotly debated, among scientists and even more so in the political world. In preparing his encyclical, Pope Francis consulted widely in the scientific community. And I think it is safe to say that a majority of scientists would support his diagnosis of the challenges threatening our environment today. However, it is in this context we should note an important caveat the Holy Father offers. I quote, "On many concrete questions, the Church has no reason to offer a definitive opinion. She knows that honest debate must be encouraged among experts while respecting divergent views. But we need only take a frank look at the facts to see that our common home is falling into serious disrepair." End of quote. The Pope is a spiritual teacher, not a scientist. He does not have the expertise to referee debates between scientists, nor is that his purpose in writing the encyclical. Repeatedly, he stresses that he is calling for a dialogue a conversation about the nature and extent of negative effects human technology has on the natural environment. In this conversation, he seeks to express some fundamental ideas in relation to these questions that arise from our Catholic tradition. Quite simply, he emphasizes repeatedly that the environmental crisis is not only a scientific issue or a political one, it is also a spiritual issue. One important assumption that we as believers bring to the conversation is the understanding that this world has been entrusted to our care by our Creator. The Pope says that for us, creation has a broader meaning than nature, for it speaks to God's loving plan in which every creature has meaning and significance. But even as we see the hand of the Creator at work in the masterpiece of creation, the Pope noted that at the same time, Judeo-Christian thought demythologized nature. While continuing to admire its grandeur and immensity, it no longer saw nature as divine. In doing so, it emphasizes all the more our human responsibility for nature. This rediscovery of nature can never be at the cost of the freedom and responsibility of human beings who, as part of the world, have the duty to cultivate their abilities in order to protect it and develop its potential. A fragile world entrusted by God to human care challenges us to devise intelligent ways of directing, developing, and limiting our power. End of quote. There are many motivations for cleaning our common home, and the Pope is speaking to people of various religions or people of no religion at all. But he points out that one of our principal motivations as Christians for safeguarding the environment is stewardship. This concept speaks to the biblical understanding of our place in God's loving plan for every creature. Approaching environmental concerns in this way introduces the crucial idea of the dignity of the human person, and thus the importance of our relationship with nature, other human beings, and with God. Pope says in his encyclical, each of us has his or her own personal identity and is capable of entering into dialogue with others and with God himself. Our capacity to reason, to develop arguments, to be inventive, to interpret reality, and to create art, along with other not yet discovered capacities, are signs of a uniqueness which transcends the spheres of physics and biology. The sheer novelty involved in the emergence of a personal being within a material universe presupposes a direct action of God and a particular call to life and to relationship on the part of a thou who addresses himself to another thou. The biblical accounts of creation invite us to see each human being as a subject who can never be reduced to the status of an object. End of the quote. Thus, in the Catholic vision, the human person has a unique dignity and at the same time a unique responsibility that comes with that dignity. This relationship not only unites each of us to the creation around us and to the Creator who has entrusted it to us, but also to one another. This brings us to the second aspect of our common home, economy. Pope Francis has shown himself to be a tireless advocate for the poor, and he raises his voice not only to defend their dignity, but to challenge economic and political systems that contribute to their condition. In Laudato Si, he eloquently links together issues of environmental concern and social justice. He says, when we speak of the environment, what we really mean is a relationship existing between nature and society which lives in it. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. Recognizing the reasons why a given area is polluted requires a study of the workings of society, its economy, its behavior patterns, and the ways it grasps reality. Given the scale of change, it is no longer possible to find a specific, discrete answer for each part of the problem. It's essential to seek comprehensive solutions which consider the interactions within natural systems themselves and with social systems. We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. That's the end of his quote. Modern society gains much from the technological advances that are being made. These can provide great assistance to the poor and the marginalized, but they can also exacerbate their plight unless these discoveries are used wisely. Crucial to alleviating poverty and misery in our world is not only how we care for our environment, but share the resources of creation entrusted to our care in an equitable way. This raises the important question of economic systems. On this topic, Pope Francis says, in order to continue providing employment, it is imperative to promote an economy which favors productive diversity and business creativity. For example, there's a great variety of small-scale food production systems which feed the greater part of the world's peoples, using a modest amount of land and producing less waste, be it in small agricultural parcels, in orchards and gardens, hunting and wild harvesting, or local fishing. Economies of scale, especially in the agricultural sector, end up forcing smallholders to sell their land or to abandon their traditional crops. Civil authorities have the right and duty to adopt clear and firm measures in support of small producers and differentiated production. To ensure economic freedom from which all can effectively benefit, restraints occasionally have to be imposed on those possessing greater resources and financial power. To claim economic freedom, while real conditions bar many people from actual access to it, and while possibilities for employment continue to shrink, is to practice a doublespeak, which brings politics into disrepute. Business is a noble vocation directed to producing wealth and improving our world. It can be a fruitful source of prosperity for the areas in which it operates, especially if it sees the creation of jobs as an essential part of its service to the common good. Maybe some of you have heard of the slow food movement. I highly recommend it to you. Alice Waters from our own Berkeley Chez Panisse was one of the instrumental founders of the slow food movement, which seeks to encourage local producers of cheese, wine, olive oil, fruits, vegetables, so that they don't go out of business faced with overwhelming competition from the conglomerates. If you go on a tour of Italy, there's a beautiful little handbook called The Slow Food Guide to Italy, and on the door of every restaurant that's a member of Slow Food, they put a little snail, and you'll be warmly welcomed. I highly recommend it. They have a local chapter here in the Bay Area. As we consider these various facets of the encyclical from a few representative paragraphs, we begin to discern the pattern of the Pope's thinking in the U.S. He is advocating an integral ecology that addresses the environmental crisis in human terms, in terms of the dignity of each and every human person, and in terms of the technological and economic systems that human beings and society develop and employ. But as I said before, the Holy Father approaches these themes from a religious viewpoint. While seeking to cooperate with all people of goodwill in addressing the many environmental and social challenges we face, the Pope underscores the spiritual crisis that he sees beneath these challenges. This is his expertise, if you will, as a spokesman for the Catholic tradition. This underlying spiritual reality brings us to the third aspect of our common home, ecumenism. At one point in Laudato Si, Pope Francis asks a very simple question and gives a very profound answer. It is, in fact, not an answer at all, but a series of very fundamental questions. I quote, "What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up?" This question not only concerns the environment in isolation, the issue cannot be approached piecemeal. When we ask ourselves what kind of world we want to leave behind, we think in the first place of its general direction, its meaning and its values. Unless we struggle with these deeper issues, I do not believe that our concern for ecology will produce significant results. But if these issues are courageously faced, we are led inexorably to ask other pointed questions. What is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and all our efforts? What need does the earth have of us? It's no longer enough then simply to state that we should be concerned for future generations. We need to see that what is at stake is our own dignity. The issue is one which dramatically affects us, for it has to do with the ultimate meaning of our earthly sojourn. I think that's probably one of the most important paragraphs of the whole 190-page encyclical. The daunting challenges raised by ecological and economic questions call for urgent practical responses. But the key idea of the Holy Father's recent encyclical is that pragmatism is not enough. The practical problems we face point to deeper questions about the purpose of life itself. Far from being remote, philosophical and theological concerns are at the heart of the crisis the world faces. Indeed, it is in part because such issues have often been brushed aside in the name of pragmatic solutions that the balance of nature is being destroyed. The dignity of the human person at every stage of life is being violated. And inhuman social and economic systems generate so much misery. It is because this is the case that the appeal the Holy Father makes in this encyclical is so urgent and so necessary. No sooner was Laudato Si published than it was attacked. Because, according to its critics, the Pope is not a scientist nor an economist. Who is he to involve himself in these complex matters? Even some of the current candidates for nominations for president have publicly criticized him in this encyclical. A careful reading of the entire document makes it clear that over and over again he presents not simply his musings on these matters, but the rich tradition of Catholic social teaching as it has developed over the past century and been articulated both by his predecessors in the chair of Peter and by other bishops throughout the world. He and the other bishops do not write as scientists or economists. They write as pastors. And it is as pastors that they deserve a hearing. Toward the end of Laudato Si, Pope Francis makes the following trenchant observation. We must regain the conviction that we need one another, that we have a shared responsibility for others and for the world, and that being good and decent are worth it. We've had enough of immorality and the mockery of ethics, goodness, faith, and honesty. It is time to acknowledge that light-hearted superficiality has done us no good. When the foundations of social life are corroded, what ensues are battles over conflicting interests, new forms of violence and brutality, and obstacles to the growth of a genuine culture of care for the environment. Immorality and the mockery of ethics, goodness, faith, and honesty. You could look at violations of this recently. Volkswagen diesel software. I mean, I work as a naval officer and Navy chaplain for 24 years. The last 2 years, over 50 captains of ships and commanding officers of bases, admirals, captains, and commodores have been removed for ethical and moral violations. Not only is it his duty as a pastor to give voice to these concerns, but it is at the heart of Christian discipleship. Having identified where the foundations of social life are corroded, the Pope speaks eloquently of a Christian response to this corrosion. That response is charity. Pope says, love, overflowing with small gestures of mutual care, is also civic and political, and it makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. Love for society and commitment to the common good are outstanding expressions of a charity which affects not only relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. That is why the Church set before the world the ideal of a civilization of love. Social love is the key to authentic development. In order to make society more human, more worthy of the human person, love in social life, political, economic, and cultural, must be given renewed value, becoming the constant and highest norm for all activity. In this framework, along with the importance of little everyday gestures, social love moves us to devise larger strategies to halt environmental degradation and to encourage a culture of care which permeates all of society. When we feel that God is calling us to intervene with others in these social dynamics, we should realize that this too is part of our spirituality, which is an exercise of charity, and as such matures and sanctifies us. Well, you see so many examples of that have happened, I would say, in my 60-year-old lifetime. I mean, President Kennedy starting the Peace Corps, different groups. When I worked in Micronesia, in the island of Chuuk, in a Jesuit mission school, most of our teachers were recent graduates of the University of Scranton who donated 2 years of their life to go overseas and teach on a hilltop in the middle of a jungle where we collected rainwater and boiled it for drinking, had kerosene lanterns at night, and taught kids from about 13 different island groups. So you see, it's not enough just to make money. You will never feel fulfilled. I think Pope is reaching in and striking this, which you see so much. So many good students on many Catholic campuses saying it's not just enough to get a degree and make more money. I won't feel fulfilled. Not only is it his duty as a pastor to give voice to these concerns, but it is at the heart of Christian discipleship. The sections I've just shared with you from Laudato Si offer a sketch of some of the themes the Holy Father treats, and more importantly, how his encyclical expresses a cohesive moral vision that embraces several central concerns: responsibility for the environment, the dignity of the human person, how technological advances in economic systems must be the servant and never the master of that dignity, and how the pragmatic challenges we face must be engaged with an eye to deeper spiritual realities. Knowledge must be rooted in wisdom. I would say the Pope cares about global warming and the greenhouse gases and all the pollution that burning coal to generate electricity causes. But he also cares about the coal miners who will be put out of a job, and how are they going to feed their families. And, his vision isn't related to just one specific department. He sees the whole thing. Creation as God's gift. A Franciscan and Ignatian perspective. Where does Pope Francis, where did he get this spirituality which he articulated in his encyclical? I want to address this second theme, how the understanding of our relationship to the world around us can nourish our spiritual life. By evoking the canticle of the creatures of St. Francis in the very title of his encyclical, the Pope reminds us that the world around us is not only precious, it is sacred. It speaks to us of the beauty of its creator and draws us to him. Here is what the Pope said to articulate this idea. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. Psalm 33. This tells us that the world came about as the result of a decision, not from chaos or chance, and this exalts it all the more. The creating word expresses a free choice. The universe did not emerge as the result of arbitrary omnipotence or a show of force or a desire for self-assertion. Creation is of the order of love. God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things. For you love all things that exist and detest none of the things that you have made, for you would not have made anything if you had hated it. From Book of Wisdom. Every creature is thus the object of the Father's tenderness, who gives it its place in the world. Even the fleeting life of the least of beings is the object of his love, and in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with his affection. St. Basil the Great described the Creator as goodness without measure, while Dante Alighieri spoke of the love which moves the sun and the stars. Consequently, we can ascend from created things to the greatness of God and to his loving mercy. The Pope continues, the universe unfolds in God, who fills it completely. Hence, there is a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. The ideal is not only to pass from the exterior to the interior to discover the action of God in the soul, but also to discover God in all things. St. Bonaventure teaches us that contemplation deepens the more we feel the working of God's grace within our hearts, and the better we learn to encounter God in the creatures outside ourselves. The idea that we can ascend from created things to God is at the heart of Franciscan spirituality. St. Bonaventure wrote a spiritual classic, The Journey of the Mind to God, as a sustained meditation on the fundamental spiritual vision of St. Francis. Bonaventure was a 13th century Franciscan theologian and doctor of the Church, who affirmed the inherent dignity of all creation to do to each creature being a vestige of the Creator and a mirror of the Trinity. As a vestige, from the Latin vestigio, literally meaning footprint, each aspect of creation bears an imprint or mark of its creator. As a mirror, all of creation reflects the Trinity. Pope Francis references this latter point when he says that the Franciscan saint teaches us that each creature bears in itself a specifically Trinitarian structure, so real that it could be readily contemplated if only the human gaze were not so partial, dark, and fragile. The Holy Father calls us to follow the example of St. Bonaventure in terms of contemplation, coming to discover God in all things. 30 years ago, when I was newly ordained, I was sent by the Jesuits to work in the mission of Western Samoa in Polynesia, South Pacific Islands. They're made famous by Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa. While I was there working in the mission, there were a large number of US Peace Corps volunteers. And just showing the relationship between Americans coming from the First World and Samoans who lived right off the land and the sea. Samoa, according to the United Nations estimate, is in the lowest 20% of GDP of any country in the world. But they have plenty to eat, and the crops, there's plenty of fruit on the trees, and crops grow well there. And in casual conversation, I remember the Samoan villagers who lived in huts and wore just lava skirt would ask these Americans, what religion are you? And some said, oh, I'm Protestant. One girl from New York said, I'm Jewish. Some said they were Catholic. But one of the Peace Corps kids said to the Samoans, I'm an atheist. And the Samoans just laughed. They said, atheist, you're from the United States of America, the richest and the most advanced country in the whole world. Yet can't you see that there are fish in the sea, fruit on the trees, families, friends, and love? Can't you look around here in our country and see the hand of God? Interesting. In fact, when the Christian missionaries first went to Samoa in the 1840s, and they translated the Bible into Samoan, it was Protestant missionaries arrived there first. When the Samoans first heard the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they said, oh, obviously that was here. They said there couldn't be a more beautiful place than our island. Interesting. Laudato Si breathes this Franciscan atmosphere. But as a Jesuit, I cannot help wondering if our Jesuit Pope also has in mind the echo of these themes in Ignatian spirituality. Father Jorge Bergoglio was a novice master in the Society of Jesus in the Argentine province. As his responsibility as a novice master, his greatest responsibility was to give the 30-day silent retreat to the Jesuit novices entrusted to his care. The 30-day silent retreat is the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, which is the foundational document of Jesuit spirituality. In the spiritual exercises, the first meditation that Father Bergoglio would preach to the novices and have them meditate on was called the first principle and foundation. And in that, St. Ignatius wrote this: the human person is created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord, and by doing so, to save his or her soul. Ignatius said, all other things on the face of the earth are created for human beings in order to help them pursue the end for which they were created. It follows, the saint says, that one must use other created things insofar as they help towards one's end, and to free oneself from them insofar as they are obstacles to one's end. St. Ignatius says, thus, as far as we are concerned, we should not want health more than illness, wealth more than poverty, fame more than disgrace, a long life more than a short one, and similarly for all the rest. But we should desire and choose only what helps us more towards the end for which we are created. I can't help but see those themes woven throughout this encyclical, which Pope Francis learned himself as a young Jesuit from St. Ignatius and then turned around and handed over to his successors. Another central meditation in the spiritual exercises that Father Bergoglio preached to those novices was the contemplation for achieving divine love. In that meditation, St. Ignatius says, love expresses itself in deeds, not just words, and the lover shares with the beloved all that he has. So St. Ignatius says, if you want to know how much God loves you, recall to mind the blessings of creation and redemption and the special favors you've received. And he says, you should ponder with great affection how much God our Lord has done for you and how much he has given you of what he possesses. And finally, how much, as far as he can, the same Lord desires to give himself to you. And reflecting on that, ask yourself, what are you going to give back? St. Ignatius continues, the second point, reflect on how God dwells in creatures, in the elements giving them existence, in the plants giving them life, in the animals conferring upon them sensation, in human beings giving them understanding. So he dwells in me and gives me being, life, sensation, intelligence, and makes a temple of me, since I am created in the likeness and image of the divine majesty. All of that I see coming through loud and clear in the encyclical Laudato Si. And my last point is Laudato Si in the mission of a Catholic university. My third and final point is reflect with you on what Laudato Si has to say to your community and the mission of St. Mary's College. When speaking to Congress recently, the Holy Father reiterated a few key themes from his encyclical and referred briefly to the contributions centers of learning can make. He said this in Congress, we have the freedom needed to limit and direct technology, to devise intelligent ways of developing and limiting our power, and to put technology at the service of another type of progress, one which is healthier, more human, more social, and more integral. Pope says, in this regard, I am confident that America's outstanding academic and research institutions can make a vital contribution in the years ahead. From all that we have heard from Laudato Si, it should be clear that the vital contribution Pope Francis has in mind is not simply a matter of technological advances. He fervently hopes that Catholic colleges and universities will be laboratories where the moral vision articulated in Laudato Si finds expression. Last week, Pope Francis celebrated Mass on the grounds of the Catholic University of America and made an unscheduled stop at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. He did not speak directly about the role of a Catholic university while he was here in the United States, but he did do so a few months ago when he was in Ecuador. On that occasion, he made the following observation when speaking at the Pontifical University of Ecuador. Holy Father said, our academic institutions are seedbeds, places full of possibility, fertile soil which we must care for, cultivate, and protect. Fertile soil thirsting for life. My question to you as educators, the Pope said, is this. Do you watch over your students, helping them to develop a critical sense, an open mind capable of caring for today's world, a spirit capable of seeking new answers to the varied challenges that society sets before us? Are you able to encourage them not to disregard the world around them? Does our life, with its uncertainties, mysteries, and questions, find a place in the university curriculum or different academic activities? Do we enable and support a constructive debate which fosters dialogue in the pursuit of a more humane world? End of quote. Well, I think the fact you even have me here today and we're all sitting here today means St. Mary's College is doing this. I would suggest that Catholic centers of higher learning like St. Mary's have a unique role to play in the dialogue and the pursuit of a more humane world. That uniqueness comes in part from the profound relationship Catholic thought sees between faith and reason. In this regard, I would suggest that you complement your reading of Laudato Si with another encyclical, this one by Pope John Paul II, Fides et Ratio. The late Holy Father spoke eloquently of the dynamic interplay between faith and reason. To present the issue as Fides et Ratio could imply a static view of two containers, one of which you dip into when something seems to be missing and the other one. You are blessed with a beautiful chapel and a wonderful library on your campus. To reduce faith and reason to static terms would be to suggest that faith is found in the chapel and reason is preserved in the library. Is it possible for a student to go through St. Mary's and never enter the chapel? Maybe, but that does not mean that the student has never been touched by the wondrous alchemy between faith and reason. I won't ask the more embarrassing question if it's possible for a student to go through St. Mary's and never visit the library. Although now everything is on these things. You know, every kind of book, every kind of article from every journal, you just stay in your room and download it all from there. Pope Francis provides a model for our discourse in his encyclical, which examines very practical challenges we face in the world around us and adds the voice of the Catholic tradition to the questions those challenges raise. In this regard, since I've spoken of Franciscans and Jesuits, I don't want to slight the Dominicans. One of the preeminent examples of the rich relationship between faith and reason is St. Thomas Aquinas. This is what Pope Paul VI said of St. Thomas. Without a doubt, Thomas possessed supremely the courage of the truth, a freedom of spirit in confronting new problems, the intellectual honesty of those who allow Christianity to be contaminated neither by secular philosophy nor by a prejudiced rejection of it. He passed, therefore, into the history of Christian thought as a pioneer of the new path of philosophy and universal culture. The key point and almost the kernel of the solution which, with all the brilliance of his prophetic intuition, he gave to the new encounter of faith and reason, was a reconciliation between the secularity of the world and the radicality of the gospel, thus avoiding the unnatural tendency to negate the world and its values, while at the same time keeping faith with the supreme and inexorable demands of the supernatural order. A reconciliation between the secularity of the world and the radicality of the gospel. In a way, those words could be a summary of Laudato Si. Such a reconciliation is always a work in progress. And as we know, it is precisely in these areas that there is often tension between the church and society. But I would make the plea that this is a healthy tension and that the world is poorer for it if our Catholic institutions do not strive to articulate what the gospel and the teaching of the church have to say on contemporary issues. Those insights, which represent the fruit of scholarly labor over the centuries in the light of the Holy Spirit, are an important part of the contribution we all can make to the conversation about the crucial issues Pope Francis sets before us in his encyclical.
Thank you for
Question and answer. I'm going to ask Professor Steve Portrait to lead the question and answer. Thank you so much.
I'm here for two reasons. First, to show you that you can be heard. If you will stand, please, and ask a direct question of His Excellency. The second reason is His Excellency is far too charitable to discipline the audience, but I am not. So I will call time if you stray from asking a question into making a statement or delivering a sermon or even a rant. Please. So I'll gesture your way. Please stand. Give us your question directly, loudly. As many of us as possible will be heard. Please.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned, I think in the discussion of Asian spirituality, the idea of using all creative things so far as the ideas to our pure man, sort of recognize sort of Augustinian idea. It also comes in the context of Augustine saying that we're not really in our spirituality, we're on our journey. And in studying different passages, so you mentioned the term from Francis on home, but also our Christian life as a Slavic. So I wonder if you could talk about how you read that, those two poles, I guess, in the document. So it's sort of an open question, such as it is.
Well, thank you. That quote from St. Augustine, that when one is on a journey, you do not mistake the inn for the final destination, has always really struck me as brilliant. I think that is one of the parts of the encyclical that people of all religions gravitated toward and said, this supports us, whether you're, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim. There's even a Sufi poet quoted in the encyclical. So I think by leaving it rather general, he doesn't say, where Jesus and Mary are there to greet you. That would be more specific to our faith tradition. But he does talk about the immortality of the human soul or the spirit that we're made to live forever, and we would say with God in heaven. I think people find that very attractive, even if they are not, Rana would say, thematically inclined to profess a particular denomination or creed. But that spirit, that the goodness survives and lives on forever with God as you understand him. I find that a very attractive part of the encyclical, which I think has drawn a lot of support. And certainly there was a Greek Orthodox archbishop at the press conference in the Vatican sitting with Cardinal Turkson that supported and spoke in favor of it. First time that's ever happened. First time Patriarch Bartholomew of the Eastern Orthodox Church quoted in the encyclical, and collaborated on it. So, I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think it answers the thing of the longings of the human heart that are expressed in poetry, music, romance, whatever, that he taps into, and I think that's why people who aren't Catholic like Pope Francis, because he hits a nerve there,
Thank you for being with us. The encyclical, Francis, urges both dialogue and action. Further, he focuses on the need for individuals and our way of living. At the diocesan level is a plan being developed that will allow our parishes, the individuals therein, individually and as a community, to be able to internalize this and make the necessary changes in our lives.
That's a fantastic question. How do you recommend we do that? I mean that very respectfully, because we bring it to the priest council. You know, a lot of ideas come to the pastors there. And all the pastors read that, say, we're jazzed by reading this. Now, how do we implement it? And what do we do? And what are other places doing? Whether it's putting solar panels in or what, it's got to be more than superficial things. It's quite a challenge. I mean, when I look at religious orders have done that in their communal living. I mean, if you ever go to visit a convent of Mother Teresa's missionaries of charity, they're only allowed 2 sets of underwear. They wash the other set every morning in a bucket. They sleep on the floor, on a mattress, on the floor. They only write on used pieces of paper. They don't do any fundraising. They live off donations of food and things, and they go around serving. I mean, the church has always had radical people that practice evangelical poverty and do, I think, what this is saying. But certainly there's a way, I'd hope every family in our diocese could do something. And that's why we need the schools, the university. Can you give us some ideas? I cut you off before you had a chance to answer how you think we should do this or could do it. What's your advice to me? You're allowed now to give a sermon. That's with all respect, please.
There are 2 levels. The second level is actually making a change, a significant change in the way I live. Simple example. I'm considering working now with the local market so that I can take my containers and take the food product home in my container as opposed to taking more plastic. This is a challenge, not for me, but to allow it to happen. It's a simple example. So, at the individual and family level, yes, it is a challenge. I see the greater challenge in needing the assistance, as Francis says, of others in community to help me internalize that this is what I must do. I can hear it, but that's a far cry from internalizing it so that I will make a change. And I believe that within the diocese, we can accomplish the first part.
Very good. Thank you very much. It's excellent.
I'll give you another from a different perspective, from a perspective of people's interaction with each other. I think we live in an age where we have so much media violence, particularly video games. And I think that the pastors and you as a bishop can get the church community to put those aside so that their children are not growing up on this type of media violence.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your wonderful words. My sub-discipline in the field of communication is media ecology, and the founder of the field was a great Catholic scholar, Marshall McLuhan. And some of the words, especially in section 47 of Laudato Si, sound like it's coming from McLuhan himself. Very short quote: "When media in the digital world become omnipresent, their influence can stop people from learning how to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. In this context, the great sages of the past run the risk of going unheard amid the noise and distractions of an information overload." Do you have thoughts on what the Church in general and we as the people of the Church can do to counteract this digital information overload?
Yes, I would hope in our parish and school communities that we would have healthy discussions that has some depth and content to them. I know with the pastors, we're always talking about how to make a better homily, or when I was in Navy chaplain school, pastors from other religions asked me, how long is the sermon in a Catholic church? And I said 10 minutes, and theirs was like 45. When I said 10 minutes, the guy said, Jeopardy is longer than 10 minutes. You know, yeah. Kids spend so much time in front of TV and radio, and people's opinions on world affairs and on church affairs is got from NPR or the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever. And when you watch the news, I watched just the other night, I watched every news channel report on Governor Brown signing the assisted suicide bill. There was not one person invited to speak of the other side. It was all just in favor. Not one, not one. To give the voice of the poor, or to say that what is now a permission to kill yourself will eventually become an obligation if you're made to feel a burden or useless to society, or if you're from a poor family and you don't have all the medical coverage to give you all the palliative care, you're not worth it. You know, nothing was given to balance, so that we rely on schools like this, on our Catholic schools, on the pulpit, articles, op-ed pieces. Although to be fair, I will say the San Francisco Chronicle did allow a number of op-ed pieces on this from physicians, scientists, others, on the danger of this law coming into place. But I think that we're almost a victim of the media. Rather, it controls us now, you know, and it plays with your thoughts. That's why a good teacher who challenges ideas or just whatever's politically correct or out there is good. To use your head, you know, you make up your own decision after getting input and listening to both sides. It's not easy in the society because we are addicted to these little toys, you know. I'm as addicted as anybody else. I find myself now checking my email before I get out of bed in the morning. Things that I used to tell people not to do, you know. But anyway, it's not going to be easy. But thoughtful, reflective conversation among trusted people that know how to read, know how to reflect, professors like yourself, academic community, good challenges from students in the classroom, you know, raising issues. And also, I would say, on the part of the church, an obligation to give some radical witness to this. I think that's why people were attracted to Francis from the beginning. It was for the symbolic things, the moving out of the papal apartment into the hotel, you know, the shoes thing, you know, some of those little things carried a lot of weight, even though, to be quite honest, moving out of the palace, as he takes up now an entire floor of what was a hotel for guests that can't stay, plus the security is such that there's a couple of parking lots there had to be closed and all the workers are upset. You don't hear all of that, but I mean, there's more implications to it, that there were good reasons why the Pope lived on top of his office over there, like I live on top of mine, you know, right now. But I'm just saying, the symbolic and radical witness to some of these values here, it gets the attention of the young, because the young are idealistic. I mean, when I take some students and we would go visit those Mother Teresa's, they would say, how could people live like this? But yet they were so happy and felt so fulfilled. And when students went around helping with the nuns and their projects, like visiting men that were in Skid Row motel rooms that were filthy, and they would go in and give them love and support, and if they knew their names. This carries a lot of weight, you know. This is, to me, a real moral education and virtue. I'm impressed with a lot of students from Catholic schools that go voluntarily to help tutor the poor, help feed the hungry, go overseas and help build a house, you know, go to Mexico, Habitat for Humanity, all these great things. Then they're connected with the channel of mercy flowing down to earth from heaven, and it has an effect. You know, especially, one of the big challenges I see with our American society, breaking the addiction of consumerism, where I have to have more, and I'm still not satisfied. Apple Computer announced they sold, 20 million new iPhone 6s. This broke their record on the first weekend. And most of those people got them already had the iPhone just right below that, you know. They create this thirst to have always the latest and the best, you know. My closet's overflowing with clothes that I can hardly wear. I mean, I have way too much. Pope Paul VI said, it's not right that some people in the world have way more than they need while others have so far less. I found one of the best things you can do in education if you have young people before they make their lifetime career goals and decisions, if they can step outside the United States, experience life maybe in a third world country, whatever, get to know the people there, then you don't really know how much you have here in the States and how really little you need materially to be happy. That family values, love, support gives so much more than material things. You know what I'm saying. Right. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for coming today. I really enjoyed your remarks. I'm a non-Catholic, but I really enjoyed the Pope's message, and his encyclical really resonated very deeply with me. But it's a big document, 190 pages. It took like a whole week to read and very hard to understand. But one message that was pretty clear to me was that he was asking for the urgent action and radical action, as you mentioned, and in particular by the polluting countries and powerful countries. I think he's pointing at us as Americans to lead the way, and I feel a moral obligation myself as a non-Catholic, and I wonder whether the pressure on the Catholic Church in America also feels like the Pope is really looking to us for some radical, urgent action. And so I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of a follow-up, like how do we really take action quickly on this? And could we do something as radical as the Vatican being the first carbon neutral as a country? Could the Catholic churches in the United States be carbon neutral churches or dioceses and so on and so forth? Are we ready to make that type of a radical and urgent shift? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we could, depending if people read and internalize the message here, because it calls for conversion. And it just can't be the Monsignor saying, this is what you got to do. You know, that doesn't really work anymore. That if people are attracted to the Pope's vision and message, and they internalize it, and then they want to make changes in their life, and then they're helped by the scientific, economic, and ecumenical community to figure out ways and steps they can take. You know, like you said, sort of develop lists of things that I can do in my family life in my home. But the church also is actively engaged with the politicians. I mean, Governor Brown called me before and after he went to the Vatican meeting that they had on Laudato Si and on global warming. And when he was over there, he kind of boasted of California as kind of, as he said, leading the way with emission reduction on cars and other kind of laws that we can do as a society that it's kind of hard for just one family or one school to do. But the fact that he's engaged on this, I was very encouraged. You know, this is from a not just political from a spiritual viewpoint.
Could you say more about why you think without you say it should be read with Fides et Ratio, and what particular challenges do you think that lays out for a contemporary Catholic institution?
I think it should be read with Fides et Ratio because it's not just a matter of faith and precept, that there are things you can see, even if you're an atheist, by looking around the world, that things aren't going well and people are in trouble. You know, the water rising, the melting of the ice cap, disappearance of different species of animals and plants and fish. It's not just a matter of faith, but the things that he says in here when they speak about science, where faith and science overlap, need to be tested by science and by reason. You know, I think that's why the Pope was criticized. They said, you're a scientist. And remember, as they told the Pope, the last time the church got involved in science, it was the Galileo affair. Made a slight mistake. Okay? So I think that's why the role of reason and science is really strong, to see what are the implications of scientific changes in the earth. And also, if we're going to propose changes or counterbalances, what are the human and scientific effects? I mentioned about the coal miners. Okay, coal is hurting the environment, but what about the coal miners? You know, what are you going to do with that? So you say, well, how does our economic system still give them employment or have them segue into something else? So it's, when it comes to science, the church realizes its limits, but the church will always pose the question, what are the moral and ethical implications of scientific discovery? For example, genetic engineering, the creation of human beings in a test tube, things like that. I think we should be very concerned if science is allowed to just have its own way without any moral, ethical, and spiritual reflection. Other societies have done that, and there's been a lot of trouble. You know.
Thank you so much, Bishop Barber, for your wisdom, your being here, and your stimulation of our thinking on this. Please join us for Mass at 5 o'clock. We'll have a Mass here, celebrated by Bishop Barber. We're all welcome to be here. So thank you all for being here, and we will continue this with the sacrifice of the Mass.